wouldn't last a single day in ancient Rome. Not because of gladiators, not because of invading armies, but because of the house you'd wake up in and the streets you'd have to walk through. Cramped spaces, smoky air that burned your lungs, and sewage flowing openly below your feet. This was everyday life, not an accident of history. The Rome many imagine as shining marble temples was in truth often an exhausting, uncomfortable place. Tonight we'll step inside this fragile world together. Imagine this moment. You walk into the heart of ancient Rome, and before you rises the Colosseum. You expect thunderous cheers, a crowd pressed together on high stone benches and the deafening sound of drums echoing against those massive walls. But instead of noise, there is only silence. The great arena that once shook with energy now holds stillness so deep that even the soft rustle of weeds growing between cracks in the stone feels louder than it should. It is a strange picture. The most famous stage of the empire, without its players, without its crowd, standing heavy under the weight of neglect. The Colosseum was not always crowned with endless activity. Wars strained the treasury, pulling what wealth remained into weapons, armor, and pay for soldiers far from Rome. The cost of games felt far away from the leaders' minds, and so the crowds inside found themselves waiting longer and longer between events. Repairs were pushed aside, corners began to crumble. At times, the wooden seating remained empty for weeks, leaving dust and birds as the only guests. The arena that once promised spectacle changed into a hollow shell, echoing with the absence of what people had come to expect. Think of it this way. The people of Rome saw their world as a stage of constant ritual and performance. Gladiator fights, animal hunts, and public games were lifeblood for distraction and pride. Without them, the Colosseum became much more than an empty building. It became a mirror of emptiness itself. Where bright banners once gleamed, now color faded into scraps of cloth that clung to their poles against the wind. Gates of iron rusted from rain, their once smooth swing reduced to a groan when pulled. The stone, chipped from time and neglect, seemed to sigh under each new season. Silence here was not peace. It was a constant reminder that something was missing. Imagine sitting in those dark seats, no crowd around you this time, your footsteps stirring old dust. You feel more like an intruder than a guest. It is not just the sight of emptiness, but the mood of it, like a carnival gone wrong where all the lights have gone out, yet the tent still sits in place. This decay came slowly but visibly. Coins were growing lighter year by year as silver content thinned, which meant public spending held less weight. What once covered festivals and repairs vanished into the pockets of war. The Colosseum stood as if waiting, yet each year fewer workers came to patch its stone. Fewer beasts were brought in to fight, and fewer crowds filled its seats. All it took was the steady erosion of wealth, and the grandest show of the empire grew quiet. Picture the corners of the arena creeping with the weeds, thin green stems forcing themselves through stone that was supposed to last forever. The walls show cracks where rain dripped and stayed, breaking down surfaces day after day. In this silence, you can almost hear the hollow whistle of wind curling through the tunnels below the stage where gladiators once waited. These sounds replace the loudness, an echo of whispers instead of roars. So what happens when the most famous place in the city becomes a monument of neglect? For the people, it was unsettling. For generations, the Colosseum was their promise of awe, a place to forget hunger or dirt streets, a chance to be dazzled. With its silence, the empire seemed weaker, less able to uphold even its own image. Entertainment had been more than distraction. It was reassurance. It told the people they lived in a city of power. Without it, the empire's strength seemed to slip. The change in the arena reflected the empire itself. Both still stood tall in shape. Both still bore stone and memory, but their heart, their funds, and their spirit grew thinner. The Colosseum was still there, but it was there in shadow, as empty as a forgotten bowl in a market stall. You can look at it and remember what it was, yet you cannot mistake what it has become. And so one symbol of grandeur faded into silence, giving the city a new mood by its absence. The people saw in this emptiness a glimpse of their own decline. The grand arena no longer sparked wonder. It revealed fragility. And if the Colosseum itself dimmed, imagine how the people must have felt when they woke each morning to face their own smaller, harsher realities beyond its gates. What if the day began not with marble walls or shaded courtyards, but with smoke stinging your nose and a roof made of fragile beams above your head? Instead of open gardens and mosaics underfoot, you wake to rough wooden floors, a narrow room, and voices pressing through every wall around you. This was the daily start to life inside the insulae, the tall, crowded apartment blocks where much of Rome's people lived. These buildings rose several stories above the streets, stacked high like uneven boxes, each one filled with families. At a distance, they looked impressive, grand walls of clay brick and timber reaching toward the sky. But inside, the truth waited. Single rooms with no space to stretch, little light, and more people packed inside than the air could hold comfortably. The wealthiest households could claim villas with fountains and open halls. Here, though, you shared wood and smoke with dozens of neighbors, stored close like goods on a shelf. You might wake to the cough of someone beside you, their tired lungs stirring dust and ash. A small hearth had burned through the night, not for comfort, but for warmth, and its smoke curled into the rafters as it had nowhere else to go. There was no chimney, no clean draw of air upward. The soot hung until you breathed it in every day, every season. Even when the fire went out, the smell stayed, clinging to clothes and skin. The stairways between floors were narrow and crooked. Some were so tight that two people could not pass together. The boards creaked when you stepped, and you could feel the hollow space beneath with each shift of weight. These beams, thin and always at risk of weakening, held entire families above you. You never felt fully safe. The sound of footsteps overhead never stopped reminding you that your ceiling might one day break away. The walls were thin enough that private life barely existed. You heard arguments through them as if they were in your own room. You caught whispers, laughter, quarrels, or the crying of a baby 2 doors down. Even mealtimes became a shared chorus, pots clanging, bread broken, water being poured, all filling the space with echoes. Smells wandered just as freely. If the neighbor tried to cook onions, the sharp scent drifted swiftly into your own room. If someone poured wine, its sourness marked the air for hours. The whole block breathed as one, though no one wished for it, and while the closeness was tiring, the threat it carried was worse. Fire never slept in these places. A single spark from a lamp, a tipped coal from a hearth, and the whole structure could be gone before dawn. Timber columns groaned and snapped quickly. flames covering rooms in minutes as the heat rose heavy through the stairways. Imagine trying to descend in the dark, pressing through neighbors who were pushing back up in panic. The smoke alone could smother an entire family before they reached the ground. This was known, felt, feared every day. You do not rest easily when you live in a wooden tower of dry beams and open flames. There were no soft beds or thick blankets waiting for you, only straw mats laid together on the floor. Some slept directly on boards, side by side, heads close to one wall while feet pressed toward the doorway. Privacy was not even a thought. You knew the rhythm of your neighbors because you had no choice. Every cough, every step above, every shift against the floor beside you reminded you of it. And when morning light touched the tight window slit, there was no calm air to greet it, only smoke again, warm and sour, filling your lungs before you had even started the day. The great capital of the world stood outside, full of temples and marble halls, but inside these apartments it was small, frail, loaded with more bodies than space. Rome's glory often meant nothing here. These were not rooms to live in comfortably. They were cages, stacked high, wrapped in wood and soot. They proved that survival was not polished stone. It was simply enduring what your home demanded of you. And yet, you accepted it because there was little choice. To step outside from this heavy air meant facing another set of trials waiting for you in the streets below. If the insula held you tight in wood and smoke, the streets held you in noise, danger, and endless motion. If you stepped outside your cramped apartment in Rome, what would strike you first? The noise, the smell, or the danger? The morning began before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops and the alleys were already alive. Sound pressed against you in all directions. Wooden wheels rattled over uneven stones, merchants shouted to claim the day's first buyers, and stray dogs barked as they darted between slow-moving carts. It was not a quiet welcome. It was a rush of life that left you little space to gather your thoughts. You found yourself in a narrow alley with walls leaning close from either side. Shadows clung to the corners even while the first light pushed across the stones. You heard iron rims grind against the road as carts squeezed by, each one heavy with their own cargo. Some carried vegetables, others amphorae filled with oil or wine. The wood groaned under strain, and if you stood too close, a wheel might brush your ankle or worse. The streets had no clear walkway. Everyone jostled for the same ground. The air itself was sharp, open gutters lining the road filled with stale water and waste. You could smell it before you saw it, a sourness that caught the throat. Mixed with this, the scent of bread from early bakers, smoke rising softly from nearby ovens trying to warm dough for the morning meal. The contrast was more unsettling than comforting. One moment your mouth watered, the next it pulled tight with disgust. Rome was like that, layering beauty and filth together until they felt almost the same. Movement meant danger. If a cart came too close, there was no place to step aside. Narrow lanes trapped you, and the weight of wheels could crush a person if they weren't quick. Imagine turning a corner and meeting a driver urging his mules forward. You had to press back against the wall, hoping the edge of the load didn't scrape you. Many were struck and left injured simply because there was no rhythm to these streets. There was little order, and accidents were common. Beyond the risks from carts, other shadows lingered. Crime found its space in these same alleys. cut purses blended easily into the crowd, slipping their hands into cloaks and bags. At dawn, their faces looked no different from your neighbors, and that uncertainty made every bump in the crowd a threat. Even when caught, justice was unreliable. Some guards passed by without concern, and others simply took their own share from the accused. You carried what you had close to your chest, knowing that safety depended largely on luck. Listen closely in this maze of sound. The clang of iron from smiths already striking tools echoed across the morning, mixing with the cry of roosters that still called from small courtyards. Sellers shouted the names of goods, fruit, cloth, or oil. Voices rough from years of repeating the same chants. Donkeys brayed as they pulled loads far too heavy for their frames. All of it washed over you in waves. The streets were alive, but not with ease. They pulsed with strain, each push matched by another. In the midst of all this, the press of the crowd gave little space for breath. Bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, robes brushed yours. Sometimes you felt the rough scrape of armor plates as soldiers passed by, their presence commanding space but adding no peace. Each step became another contest. You hurried more than you strolled. Few lingered long unless they had reason. Standing still too often invited both suspicion and theft. What made it worse was the unpredictability. Some days patrols were strict, others they were hardly seen. Rules existed but shifted depending on who enforced them. One morning you might feel at least watched over, another you felt abandoned entirely, left to guard yourself. This uncertainty bred both fear and resilience. People learned to move with purpose, eyes scanning, keeping hands close to their sides. The street itself taught you habits of survival, and these habits were not gentle. The image of a grand capital fades in such alleys. The roads that were supposed to be channels of energy, carrying the flow of an empire, became instead places to navigate with caution. They were less like open veins and more like battlegrounds where each person fought not against an enemy but against the everyday press of noise, smell, and closeness. The true struggle lay not in the grandeur of armies but in merely avoiding a wheel, a thief, or a misstep into waste. This was the world you stepped into each dawn. The streets were not polished marble avenues. They were raucous, clogged, and laced with hazard. And as you hurried forward among the carts, the smells, the press of strangers, one thought pressed ever clearer. You had to find food. Amid this swirl of sound and strain, another challenge began. The search for enough bread to last the day. You might expect feasts on long tables with roasted meats and bowls of fruit spilling over the sides. That picture often clings to Rome in the imagination. But the truth is more fragile. What happens when even bread, the simplest need, feels out of reach? Imagine standing in the middle of a busy marketplace, stomach hollow, and realizing that food is not something you can count on. It is an anxious hunger, the kind that follows you all day, whispering of scarcity. For most of Rome's history, the city needed grain to arrive steadily to feed its millions. But this stream could falter. A poor harvest somewhere far away meant less grain sent down the river. Ships stopped by storms or blockades meant empty stalls in the capital. Plagues kept farmers from their fields, leaving crops to spoil before they could be cut. You saw these forces not from afar, but in the shape of thinner loaves in your hands, and in the length of time you had to wait as you stood in line before the bakers. The meals were simple even when supply held strong. Bread was the center of almost every plate, broken and eaten with olives, sometimes figs when the season allowed. If you had more luck, you might stretch the bread with a dollop of soft cheese. But when shortages came, the ritual of these meals turned into frustration. Olives were too sharp or too few. Figs were missing entirely. Bread alone could be stale, hard, crumbly enough to scrape the roof of your mouth. Repetition of bare sustenance reminded you not of empire but of survival. Picture the market swelling with people jostling forward, every hand reaching for the same small goods. Merchants shouted their prices, voices sharp over the din, while those waiting groaned and argued. You could feel impatience pressing around you just as surely as the heat. A stall of olives ran out before you reached the front. You stared at the empty baskets, only pits left behind. The sound of coins clinking nearby made you wonder if yours would be enough when it was your turn. Prices could soar without warning. A basket of figs one week seemed fair, the next week it felt cruel. You watched loaves shrink while the cost swelled. Some stretched their wine, pouring water into it so the volume doubled though the taste soured. Meat, once bought in celebration, became the mark of the wealthy, a scent that passed by your nose but rarely landed on your tongue. To carry coins into the marketplace gave no promise you would leave with what you needed. Inflation added its own quiet pressure. Coins in your hand carried less than they once did. They were the same in size and shape, but lighter, filled with cheap metal instead of the silver that once gave them weight. You sensed their weakness when merchants frowned, testing them, demanding more pieces for less food. In this way, each purse stretched thinner, and the effort to feed a family grew heavier. Think of this system like a clay pot cracked at the base. Nudge it once with a small shock, and maybe the water still holds. But press again, or let weight build too high, and soon it leaks from every seam. Rome's food system was that pot. The cracks could come from disease, war, or weather. Each blow worsened the break. Each family felt the spill. Hunger was not an accident or a mistake. It was a daily gamble played by millions, and the dice were rolled far from their hands. Some days the table teased abundance, and a loaf was warm, thick, filling, paired with olives that actually satisfied. Other days the table delivered little more than sawdust bread and sour wine, thin comfort against a long shift of labor. And so you lived with the uncertainty, carried home whatever handful you could manage, and prepared to share it carefully across the household. Where once Rome's wealth had seemed endless, food itself revealed how fragile that wealth truly was. A grand empire looked no stronger than its empty baskets and shrinking loaves. You nibble the bread, sip the wine, chew an olive's thin meat, and though you eat, you do not feel full. Yet this meal must carry you through. The day continues and the body does not wait. And still, after swallowing this portion and quieting your hunger for the moment, another challenge waits in the corner of living. Eating was not the end of hardship. Even the most private act, answering nature itself, carried its own trial in the world of Rome. What if privacy, the kind you take for granted today, was replaced by a crowded stone room where every seat pressed close beside another? Imagine stepping into such a place, not with doors, not with quiet, but with rows of heavy benches carved with holes, each one close enough that your arm nearly brushed the person beside you. That was the Roman latrine, a communal solution to a problem every human shares. yet handled in a way that feels strangely exposed. Instead of retreating into a private corner, you walked across a wide floor where stone benches stretched in long lines. Some were curved, some straight, but the idea stayed the same. You sat shoulder to shoulder with strangers, each facing forward, each keeping their posture with a mix of awkward courage and acceptance. Conversation flowed here as easily as in the marketplace outside, voices echoing off the stone walls, bouncing above the trickle and splash of water below the benches. Laughter, small talk, gossip. It all carried through the space as if you were gathered at a tavern rather than a toilet. Beneath those benches ran shallow streams of water. These channels carried away the waste as best they could, though the air told you that not all left as swiftly as planned. Above the benches, buckets and troughs held water for a tool that feels stranger still to imagine: the sponge on a stick. One was not enough for each person. Instead, these sponges were shared, dipped into flowing water, and then reused by the next who came. It was practical by Roman standards, but to modern eyes it feels like an invitation for illness. Think of the unease here. You shifted on smooth, cold stone, hearing the scrape of sandals as someone settled beside you. You reached for the sponge, knowing it carried traces of others already. Each movement reminded you that sanitation was not measured by protection, but by how quickly water could wash away what was left behind. The trough trickled, the sponge dipped, passed, replaced again. A rhythm of necessity, but one heavy with risk. The hazards were not hidden. Shared tools like this spread illness quickly. Air inside these rooms was damp and sometimes sour, a mix of standing odors, stagnant water, and bodies gathered too close. In the warmth of summer, the smell hung heavier, clinging to cloth and skin even after you left. During colder days, the dampness stiffened the air, but the closeness remained, breath meeting breath under vaulted ceilings. This was a necessary place, but it was not a place of comfort. And yet, by the standards of their neighbors across the known world, Rome's latrines stood as an achievement. Many regions had little more than open pits or fields, while here water flowed, stone benches stood firm, and entire blocks shared one large facility rather than crowding their alleys. It was impressive for its order and engineering, even as it carried undeniable danger. Like much of Roman life, it revealed ambition. They built for the many on a scale rarely seen before, sacrificing privacy for efficiency. Still, efficiency came with a cost. Imagine the simple act of relieving yourself becoming a reminder of fragility. You could not enter such spaces without brushing against the risks of poor hygiene and the chance of infection spreading from one body to another. Each visit pressed you into the same chain of exposure as hundreds of others. Nature's call never felt private. It was a duty carried out together, each person adding to the chorus of chatter, the splash of water, the uneasy laughter masking discomfort. The sensory details deepened that unease. Your sandals skidded softly on damp stone, and each step left a faint print that glistened until another boot filled the same space. Droplets formed in shadowed corners, dripping at intervals that matched your heartbeat. The water streamed beneath, not fast but steady, carrying waste away toward larger channels hidden below the streets. The bench was cool and unwelcome at first touch, making you shift until you accepted its reality. And all the while, other voices filled the space. Chuckles from young men pretending at ease, Murmurs from women sharing quiet words, groans from elders weary of the climb to enter. If you pause for a moment inside that soundscape, you can sense the contrast. Roman ingenuity on display, yet tangled with risk. It is like a grand hall lit softly, but one where each lamp flickers, never steady, always hinting at darkness. The comfort of advanced design shimmered against the edge of fear. They had built something far ahead of simpler traditions, yet each visit carried with it the chance of disease lingering unseen on sponge, stone, and air. Even here, in one of the most ordinary routines of life, survival was uncertain. A simple act carried both the promise of shared structure and the hazard of shared sickness. The Roman dream of order pressed onto these benches of stone revealed that even at its height,